I'm sure every person watching this can relate. I want my life to mean something. I want to be solving deeper, more important questions with my life so that I don't feel like I'm just running someone else's plays. What is it that I truly need and desire and am seeking so that I could achieve this sense of fulfillment, literally to be filled full, to have that experience that we've all experienced at the dinner table of like, I've had enough and I don't want any more. Nobody really seems to have cracked this code. Welcome to this video about how to get all our needs met by simply getting one thing that we need that we may not even know that we need, and how to get it even if we don't know what it is, even once I tell you what it is that we need it, and you still may not know exactly what it looks like, but that's okay because you can still have the benefit of it anyways, and that all sounds kind of confusing, but I promise it'll make sense. Ultimately, this is a video about how to feel better. We have these things that we need, and then we have these things that we want, and there are a lot of different ways to delineate between needs and wants, but I think the most effective for our purposes in terms of trying to improve ourselves and improving ourselves really just means to align our experience of self and our behavior outwardly to the world to better align those two more in alignment with who we desire ourselves to become over time. That's to better ourselves or improve ourselves, right? For self-betterment purposes, probably the easiest lens to look at all this through is needs are these things that consciously or unconsciously, they are installed into us as like cravings or things that drive us to go get and acquire stuff, or stuff can be, physical stuff or emotional stuff or relational stuff or whatever. And then wants are more like cognitively developed strategies to try to efficiently meet needs. So I'll give you an example. We have like a core need for energy and vitality and basic health, like a sense of aliveness that indicates to us sensationally that our safety and physiological needs are met. Like we want to feel like we've had enough food, and we want to feel like we've had enough sleep, and we want to feel like we have enough oxygen. And the way that we experience that is we have this need to feel vital and energized, right? But then we also have, let's say, a need for recreation or social connection or stimulation, mental stimulation or variety might be how you characterize that need. And so the want, which is again, a strategy for efficiently meeting our needs, would be like, you know what, I really want to join a pickleball club. And what we don't necessarily consciously think about is that want to join a pickleball club is actually a strategy that we've cognitively developed to simultaneously and efficiently meet the need for energy and vitality in the form of exercise. But the reason we say, I want pickleball rather than treadmill is because it also might meet our need for some social connection or a sense of belonging or a sense of novelty. Maybe it's a new thing. Maybe it looks fun. Maybe it aligns with our identity because it's fast paced and there's a lot of movement, but there's no like hard, like a baseball, we're less apt to get hurt because that might remind us of unconsciously of an experience we had when we were a kid where we got hit in the face with a baseball and we developed a need to not have that happen again, right? So it's like we have these needs that are sort of semi to unconscious, and then we have these wants that are like these ideas we come up with to go try to efficiently get needs met, often multiple needs at the same time. So hopefully that's a useful example to understand that. Like honestly, even just explaining that little bit, that little example and sort of the concepts behind it, it's sort of exhausting. Like I'm like tired. I'm like, oh, that was just one example of one thing that we would want hypothetically to get multiple needs met. But the more you study needs theory, the more you realize we have all these different needs. And then the more you look at your own life, is I have all these different wants. And then like life just becomes this endless sort of non-linear sequence of complicated and confused strategies to try to get all these wants accomplished because of all these unmet needs get met that like ultimately sort of all blurts itself out into reality as our life. And we wonder why our life is messy and not going where we might imagine that it would be, or we have this general feeling of like futility or frustration. And I'm sure that you're resonating with what I'm saying because that's basically the human condition I just described. And it takes place in all the different areas of life within our physical, our personal, our professional lives, and so forth. And so this has been a general, I'll call it like a meta question, right? It's a question, but it's really like this endless series of questions that we constantly re-experience throughout our life. I'm like, why am I this way? Why do I want this way? Why did I make that decision? Or why do I want this thing? Why did I choose that, not this? Why do I engage in this behavior, even though I promised myself I wouldn't, right? And so it sort of produces this like endless series of circumstantial questions that all ultimately roll upwards to this meta question of like, what is it that I truly need and desire and am seeking so that I could achieve this sense of fulfillment, literally to be filled full, to have that experience that we've all experienced at the dinner table of like, I'm full and I don't want any more. Like, we want that for our entire life. Not I'm stuffed, oh, I overate and I feel sluggish, but just I've had enough and I don't want any more. That is the feeling that we're all striving for generally in our life, and we're doing it through literally millions of little decisions and choices and pursuits and, you know, endeavors that often end up in conflict with each other and ourselves, and it's just this messiness called life. And so I have been obsessing over this question. Like, this is the fundamental obsession of my life since I was about 16 years old, and I saw the world through the lens of all these needs and wants and all these like futile attempts to get all of that stuff met, and that like nobody seemed terribly fulfilled in the process, whether it was the people I was in high school with, or their parents, or their parents, or their siblings, their older siblings who are in college, or even older siblings, or maybe, you know, uncles and cousins who had entered the workforce. Like, I just was like evaluating the world through the lens of all the different people I had in my sphere and seeing like nobody really seems to have cracked this code, but we all seem to have sort of semi-willingly just gone along with the trend that life is this endless experiment to try to satisfy this. But most of us don't seem to have actually stopped and defined what the point of the experiment even is. And not surprisingly, the more research I did, the more I saw that, I guess the best way to sort of describe it is that all human life ends on a spectrum of regret and despair. And that's not to say everybody that dies is miserable and full of regret and full of despair, but that's the spectrum, right? It's like, as we reach the end of life, we evaluate our, as far as we know, one shot, our one go round, our one round of play, so to speak, in this life. And we are evaluating ourselves to say, like, to what extent do I regret that I did or didn't, you know, hit the mark? And to what extent am I in despair that I'm not going to get a do-over and I'm running out of time? And so I started making very intentional life choices, I think at an age earlier than most. I sometimes joke that I had my midlife crisis at 16 years old, and I just threw up my hands and said, I don't want to participate anymore. I dropped out of high school, became a jazz musician, wrote poetry, wrote musicals, did all this sort of abstract stuff, was very poor through most of my 20s, but it was all because I had just sort of decided that I wasn't gonna accept the world's like fiat of saying, these are the things that matter and these are the things you should be focused on. I was gonna go try to figure it out for myself. And I came from a very normative environment. It was like upper middle class. It was about performance. It was about what college you got into and what job you got and what track you were on. And that was the paradigm of the world that I was in. I was in like a pretty elite private school, and I just rejected all of it because of what I later would adopt to the Viktor Frankl's description of as what he called the will to meaning. This like, I want my life to mean something. I want to be solving deeper, more important questions with my life and my choices. And I want to have like a framework to understand myself through so that I don't feel like I'm just running someone else's plays. Like I'm on a team and the coach is calling plays that I don't even know, and I'm just being told what to do. And I'm just out there being a good little soldier running the plays I'm being told to run, and none of it means anything. And I abdicated my free will even by participating in the game, right? I just didn't want that life. And again, most people I talk to about this, they get what I'm saying. So I don't need to belabor the point. I assume you do too. And frankly, I assume you probably feel some measure of that in your own life. Ultimately, through all of this searching, what I've arrived at and ultimately built an entire methodology and pretty large business around is this idea that what we actually need in our life is a purpose. And again, Viktor Frankl nailed it. He called it the will to meaning. But it's like, I mean, purpose is what makes our life mean something. And as a technical matter, the word purpose comes from the old French word proposer, which is essentially my proposal, or to propose, proposer, to propose. But it's like in the sense of my proposition to the world, my stand, that term stand, like that for which I will stand up and that for which I will stand out, thus implying most of the world, like to take a stand or to be a stand or to be a standout or to be a stand-up guy or whatever, to stand for something, sort of this implication that like most humans are either seated or kneeling. They're either seated and passive or kneeling and submissive. And there's a few of us that will live a life based on a stance, right? And interestingly enough, when you take a stand, you have the ability to understand, which is to stand under something and thus sort of like humbly, understand thy place, so to speak, but it requires standing. Notice the word isn't to undersit or to underkneel, it's to understand, right? A lot of stuff makes sense. This is why Augustine said, understanding is the reward of faith. Seek not to understand that thou may believe, seek to believe that thou may understand, right? That it's like you have to commit to a set of beliefs and stand for something, and the reward of that is understanding that comes from the humility of having made a choice and so forth. I don't need to go further down that rabbit hole, but this concept of purpose as linked to taking a stand for something is, I believe, the key to the unification of all our needs, and it's the ultimate efficient strategy that can ultimately subsume and replace all of our wants, right? So if we think of wanting things as these sort of clever little strategies for trying to get needs met efficiently, often multiple at the same time, we could think of purpose as the sort of overarching want, the want of all wants, the aggregation of all wants. Frankl called it the will to meaning. The will, or almost like the wanting of the meaning, is ultimately the thing that brings together all wanting, all clever strategy for meeting of needs into one that is the actual need that we need. And this is, I think, the differentiation of humans, right? Because the ultimate ontological question underneath all of this is like, why us? Why me? Why am I a part of this experiment, whether we consider it to be like a eschatological God experiment that was to create a species that was oriented toward a particular spiritual end, or we consider it to be like just raw and Darwinian and just, evolved from the ooze, like whatever lens you want to look at it through, there is obviously this experience of being a human where we know that we're different, and we're part of the want is to understand why. And so I believe, and I think many intelligent thinkers from all different, even seemingly opposed disciplines tend to agree with this, that there is some differentiator between to be a human and to be anything other than a human, right? And I actually think this will to meaning, or this seeking of purpose, or even just this notion of the identity as a valuable self, something to draw out, something to, in Maslow's terms, to actualize. And we'll look a little deeper at Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a lens for this. But that's like fundamentally what sets us apart as humans, is we have some essence that we consider the self, that we're trying to bring out into the world, that's differentiated from all the other selves, right? And that's what sets us apart, I think, from all other animals or all other, living creatures. And so hopefully you're willing to come with me, at least as a thought experiment, on this idea that purpose is the unification of all wants in the sense of strategies for getting needs met. And this is like the big, bold statement of this video, is that the seeking and ultimately realization of our purpose is the kind of the key, or call it the catalyst, to getting all of our needs met in a way that actually works and is functional in a life, as opposed to the way most of us get most of our needs met most of the time, which is in a way that is dysfunctional and sort of self-opposing within a life. Because if you think about the typical life, mine, yours, all of ours, we have these different needs, right? And what we do is we develop, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to actually head off camera or move the camera to show you a chart to actually dig into the needs, and then we'll come back and like bring this all together. But ultimately what I was about to say is we develop these different identities, or what you might think of as different versions of self, or even different selves. And we do that to get different needs met. Now, in the most extreme cases where the selves are so oppositional, they're so in conflict with each other that it's actually untenable for them to live in the same psyche, the human mind will actually compartmentalize itself and develop what's called multiple personality disorder, which is literally different selves, sometimes with different names, different backstories, different identities. But ultimately, those are defense mechanisms to say, okay, the one self is so under siege or scourge that certain core needs are unmeetable as this self. And so in order to protect this self, I'm gonna have to create a different self that has the traits to be able to go get those needs met. Now, I'm not suggesting that, you have multiple personality disorders. As far as I know, I don't either. But it's illustrative of how the human psyche creates these different characters or identities, or sometimes in psychology, they'll talk about wearing different masks or even different costumes to create these different personas in the world that can go get different sets of needs met. And so the hypothesis of this video, and the next video too, is that purpose is actually the only way we can align these selves so that they can stop competing and start cooperating, which means instead of having to get some needs met at the expense of others, we actually have a chance to think of it as like an internal collaboration to actually go get all of our needs met, because we now have a guiding principle known as purpose. So on that note, let's actually look at the needs, and let's look at the different selves that we organize. Sort of generally, all of us organize into a few different selves to get these needs met. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about how purpose brings them all together. Okay, so we just want to briefly kind of pause to look at needs so we can try to understand ourselves and this general cluster of needs that we're trying to get met, and how we split ourselves into these different selves to get those needs met. And then we'll circle back to how purpose unifies all these efforts and ultimately makes it all work a lot better. So first, we'll look at the most commonly referenced way of organizing human needs, the famous Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. You've likely heard that. So the 5 basic sets of needs are physiological needs: water, food, air, procreation; safety needs: shelter, clothing, reasonably warm but not too warm, and cool but not too cool temperature, so to speak. Belonging, this is like things sort of like fitting into society. Esteem, which is like standing out and being recognized in society. There's also sort of a self-esteem component to this, so it's like being recognized by others, but also being valued by self. And the latter starts to kind of level up into the final need, the highest order need in his hierarchy of self-actualization, which is this general set of needs that we might call creativity, self-expression, identity, values, principles, just being fully ourselves in the world. And this, I think, in line with what I said earlier, this is where we separate ourselves as humans, right? Like even higher order primates like to be standouts in their tribe, and even some like aquatic mammals like to be standouts in their tribe. And actually like wolves. And I mean, there's lots of pack animals where people like to stand out in their tribe. You call it esteem needs, but only humans have this self-actualization sense, right? And so you can see along this hierarchy of needs, I've introduced the 3 selves: the survival self, the social self, and the spiritual self. Again, these are the personas or the personality trait sets that we essentially develop. I almost think of them as like adapted coping mechanisms of ways to be and present ourselves in the world to get these different needs met. And we all know that, just as a crude illustration, like doing meditation and spontaneously improvising jazz melodies, or whatever we might characterize as like our particular spiritual expression, is not likely to get our safety and our physiology needs met. Like nobody's gonna provide us shelter, well, I guess unless we're a very good musician, for spontaneously improvising jazz melodies, or certainly if you're sitting around meditating, nobody's gonna pay us for that, right? And so we develop the survival self that allows us to get our basic needs met, and even a certain amount of belonging. And so that's where this is kind of a spectrum of selves, where like this self blends into this self and blends into this self. It's not like a discretely separated self, depending on the needs that we're trying to get met. And so within each of these, there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of how much stuff do we need materially in order to actually be safe. And at what point does that cross over into, okay, this is probably a little more than I need just to be safe, but it's stuff that I need in order to be acceptable to society, right? Like maybe I don't need a 2,000 square foot house to be safe. I actually only needed like a 600 square foot apartment to be safe. But by getting the 2,000 square foot house, I feel a little more safe still, because I'm held in higher regard by society, which opens up more opportunities, which increases the probability that I'll be able to stay safe over a longer period of time, because I'm more, highly regarded and more desirable as for employment or other opportunity or whatever, right? So I'm just illustrating, it's kind of a spectrum. And another place where we really see the spectrum is at the level of esteem, right? Obviously, it's good to fit in, that's belonging. And it's good to stand out, but only to a point. If you stand out too much, this is my Robert Greene 48 Laws of Power coming up. If you stand out too much, then whoever's the current ruler of the tribe might start to resent you, and you might start to be in danger for standing out too much, right? This is why the ultra wealthy are actually resented. Like, you know, I'm not a billionaire, but I think if I were today, I might worry like, geez, what's going to happen in the world? Like, it feels like we're moving towards this point where, you know, the mass might come drag me out of my home and murder me in the street simply because I have too much. I've stood out too much, right? And that's just, you know, financial standout. There's other ways to stand out. And this is the challenge, right? As we stand out too much, as we start to truly self-actualize, like the fully self-actualized person is a 1 in 8 billion standout. In other words, they're, you know, it's like Oscar Wilde said, be yourself, everyone else is taken. This person is fully themselves, but they have stood out possibly beyond the threshold where it brings esteem, and actually from the majority, it might bring scorn. But that's the trade we make to be fully self-actualized, right? And, you know, evolution and consciousness is sort of us expanding our ability to understand people at different levels of this and the actions that different people take. That's a whole other video subject. But the point is, for now, we develop these different selves, right? So the social self is like, okay, I have to have a certain amount of safety in order to be accepted socially, because if I'm constantly in danger, I represent a certain sort of contagion that is undesirable socially. So even my social self is somewhat invested in safety as it's transitioning from the survivor self, which is very, very invested in safety. And then the social self, super invested in belonging, invested in esteem, right up to that point where I start to stand out too much, or I start to have too much esteem, because now I'm becoming socially undesirable because people might start to resent me. But that's okay, because my spiritual self is longing for more. As I become more and more truly myself in every sense of the word, my spiritual self is fulfilled, perhaps at the expense of my social self, and perhaps to the actual detriment of my survival self, because my survival self is saying, stop being so dang individuated, stop having all this calling to hire whatever, just shut up, put your head down, do the job, get paid, and survive, right? And so, you know, I can only imagine like a homeless person who is totally operating from here, but still feeling these. And I'm not a sociologist, I haven't studied it, but I can only, like, one thing I will say is I did give a small aside, I gave a ride to a homeless person in the middle of the night, and I took him and his, I don't know if it was his girlfriend, it was like his current love interest who was also homeless. I drove them out to, this was a long time ago when I was much more reckless, and late at night, and it was like a 30-minute drive with like 2 homeless people in the back of my car, a man and a woman, and it was actually really fascinating to hear them bickering about their community and their fight they were having within the context of their relationship and their community of homeless, like, you know, transients, because they're so like neurologically grounded here, but you could see them still trying to manifest these parts of themselves even from down here. And anyway, like I said, that's an aside, but the point is, I think that all of these selves and all of these needs are like irrepressible, and we will find ways to express them in our life. And most of us could probably think in the context of our own life, okay, just looking at how like this self is sort of meeting these needs and some of these needs, this self is meeting these needs and some of these needs and some of these needs, and this self is meeting these needs and maybe a few of these needs. And how are these selves, how am I betraying my true nature, my spiritual nature in social circumstances? Or how am I betraying my own survival sometimes through choices that I might make for social approval or for, like, you know, the actualization of self, right? We can all, I think, in the context of our own life, feel how we sort of compete at this level. Okay, so anyway, that's the 3 selves viewed through one lens of needs analysis per Maslow. Now there's actually a more sophisticated, or at least perhaps a different lens through which needs have been analyzed and organized by an economist, Max-Neef, first name, I want to say like Malcolm or whatever. But anyway, he has this kind of more robust assessment. He calls it the matrix of needs and satisfiers. And he's actually an economist. So he looks at needs through a utilitarian lens of like, how is the aggregated behavioral choices of all humans within the framework of resources, i.e. economics and, money and assets and stuff and value and product and exchange and trade and all that. But his definition of a healthy economy is the economy that best meets the needs of all of its participants. And so he tries to understand all of economics through the lens of human needs. And in so doing, he's come up with a kind of a more precise landscape of needs and how they manifest through our behaviors. And from his vantage point, it's our behaviors as they contribute to the overall exchange of resources inside the economy, but ultimately our behaviors in the forms of our being, our having, our doing, and our interacting. And we don't necessarily need to get that much into this. It's just, I think, another useful lens for looking at our own needs of like, okay, what is it that I strive to be on the basis of this need? What is it that I strive to have on the basis of this need? What is it that I then go do on the basis of this need? And how is it that I go interact in the world on the basis of this need, right? Here we start to see needs more directly translating to behavior. So you might think of these as the dimensions that describe the being, having, doing, and interacting of the different selves. But nonetheless, we see the same dynamic at play. And Neif was really clear in his matrix of needs that this is not an exhaustive list, this is just an illustrative list, but we still see the same concepts at play. So his need of subsistence, protection, those correlate basically to Maslow's physiology and safety, right? Affection, understanding, participation. Those obviously tie in with like our social set of needs, our belonging needs, right? Affection from others, understanding from others, participation with others. And then you start to get into the needs that we might think of as more a part of self-actualization. And he expanded those a lot more. He has idleness, which is essentially recreation or relaxation or downtime, creation, identity, and ultimately freedom, right? Again, we can see how Maslow's taxonomy roughly correlates to Neif's taxonomy. And we once again see the three selves that organize to go after these needs. And so I've flipped them from Maslow's hierarchy, but our survival self is really about subsistence and protection. Our social self is about affection, understanding, and participation. Our spiritual self is about idleness, creation, identity, and freedom, and ultimately transitioning into what we might call the transcendent or the metaphysical that we kind of feel, but science doesn't do a lot to define. That's why most of these theories cut off at the metaphysical, not because that's not acknowledged or real, but just because science doesn't really attempt to organize it and define it. But still, we have these three selves, and these three selves manifest through being, having, doing, and interacting. And that's probably all that we really need to say about needs and how we get them satisfied. All I've really tried to do here is through Maslow and through Neif, hopefully enroll you in the idea that we have this general cloud of needs. The needs can roughly be organized along dimensions of self as those that are related to survival, those that are related to social connection, and those that are related to some sort of like spiritual expression or manifestation or actualization or whatever big words you want to apply to it. But that as a practical matter, when we're going out into the world, because we're not thinking about it in these terms, and I think we're only half consciously even thinking about it in these terms, but we all, I don't think we have conscious awareness of this, but I do think we have a conscious awareness of this, where we go out into the world and we've created these different identities or these different selves. And you'll notice that one of the higher order needs is identity. So we actually have a need that is by itself in conflict with our general strategy of fragmenting the self to go get all our needs met, because we actually deeply crave to have one unified identity. And yet most of us go live in the world in a way that fragments our identity based on the different needs that we're trying to meet, because we don't have this underlying belief, because we're not taught this, we're not conditioned this. This is part of what has changed in postmodern society, is that we don't think we can get all of our needs met simply as one version of ourself. Now, historically, sort of like, not to get into like cultural theory, but there is this sort of, you might call it an antiquated notion now, that if you build a life that is grounded enough, Stephen Covey wrote about this in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he differentiated between the character ethic and the personality ethic. And he said pre-World War II, we had this concept of the character ethic, which is that if I create an identity that is grounded enough in values, then I can create one sort of coherent identity, one total self that can go out and get all needs met. But, at least from his point of view, that all changed in the last 100 or so years. And now we fragment the self depending on the different needs that we want to get met. Hopefully that's enough for you to come with me in looking at your own life and go, yeah, I kind of do that. I kind of am different. I'm different versions of self for different groups or different circumstances. And probably the easiest example, and I know a lot of people that actually talk about this, is I have to put on my armor when I go to work. I have to be a certain way in my job. And then when I transition back to home, especially if I have a family, I almost have to have like a decontamination period. I think of like Clark Kent going into the phone booth to come out as Superman, and then Superman has to go back into the phone booth to come back out as Clark Kent. Like a lot of us, we go to work and on our way home, I know men that'll sit in their garage for like 20 minutes and just like meditate and decompress just to become the person that can go back in and engage their family as the person they want to be, not the person they tried to leave behind at the office, right? That's just sort of a good example of how we do this in our lives. I'm sure you relate, okay? So now let's get back to talking about how purpose can become the cleanup for all of us. We're gonna cover the mechanics of most of this in the next video. So to kind of bring this video home, what I wanna just establish is that, as I said, purpose is how we can consolidate and align those selves. We can essentially reconstruct or reintegrate what becomes disintegrated over the course of our life, which is that as we go out into the world and we face challenges, which usually takes the form of trying to get some need met and encountering resistance, and we start to adapt to that and we become different things to different people or different people to different environments, because that is initially because we lack coherence and we lack a sense of purpose. And when we're young, we're great observers, but horrible interpreters of the why behind things. And so we're just sort of reactively doing stuff. And frankly, just again, as perhaps another tangent, like high school is the worst. I mean, most of us learn to totally fragment ourselves in high school, as we start going through the identity versus role confusion stage of psychosocial development, we start to literally compartmentalize because the identity versus role confusion, that's the primary conflict of adolescence. As we start to clarify our role in society, we literally start to develop different identities to meet the different sets of role expectations that we face in trying to get our needs met at that very needy, very uncomfortable age. And we lose that core sense of identity. And that's where I think the character ethic has shifted, is that we used to be predominated at that critical formative stage of life by some sort of institutionalized value set. And it may have been a terrible value set. It might have been some super oppressive religious culture that we were underneath, or some super nationalistic tyrannical government, or some monarchy set at the time. But like at least there was some higher order like orienting framework for the totality of identity development, and to which all roles were expected to conform within that society. And so as malevolent or amoral or immoral as it may have been at any given time, at any given place throughout history, at least it was more integrated in the form of the identity that we develop. But that's where this like existential crisis that is almost the defining trait of modern society comes from, is that because we've removed those like dominant value sets from these critical developmental periods of human, mostly childhood, but human stages, our identity fragments depending on the different roles that we're trying to fit into, and which a role is itself a cluster of needs that are trying to get met through some sort of shared set of experiences within a group of people, right? And so we ultimately end up with this fragmented identity set, these different selves. And this is why purpose, and I think it's interesting, I talked about how the character ethic started to shift around World War II. The development of Frankl's will to meaning and sort of logotherapy principles came out of World War II. He was in a concentration camp, and he did all this work after World War II, after having seen how humans in the ultimate void of values, which it doesn't get less principled and value-centric and more sort of like, you might just say, purely reduced to the survival self than a concentration camp under the Nazis, right? He was in Auschwitz. he saw how humans still manifested this will to meaning, and that ultimately someone wasn't gonna die just because they were emaciated or just because they were sick. Someone was gonna die because they had abandoned the sense that their life had meaning. That was his observation through that experience, is that when people give up on the idea of seeking purpose in their experience, that's actually the catalyst to death, as much or more than even like, privation or physiological, harshness, right? That's sort of the catharsis of this video, is that if we have purpose, if we seek purpose, if we accept as the fundamental operating principle of our life that we are striving for purpose, and we start to orient our life, and we start to orient our sense of all these different needs that we're trying to meet as having one unifying principle, which is that they all point us in service toward a purpose. That is the beginning point for the reintegration of the selves. That is how we get the survival self to stop competing with the social self and the spiritual self. That is how we get the social self to stop competing with the survival self and the spiritual self. And that is how we get the spiritual self to stop competing with the survival self and the social self. We can get them all to finally cooperate and align when we accept that there is something larger, like I said, the meta need. I call it the meta want, the want of all wants, the want to satisfy all wants, the want to produce the feeling of being filled full, the fulfillment feeling, at which point all wants are satisfied. And so we are no longer trying to devise strategies to get needs met, because we feel the sensation of progress in the direction of the meeting of all needs. That all emerges through this sense of purpose. By the way, that's great news, because as I talk to a lot of people in my work, there is this curtain of hopelessness and pointlessness that seems to be draped over most people's lives in the modern world. And as you realize that no matter what's going on out there, no matter what decisions society seems to be making, we still internally have this unsnuffable sense of purpose that is why we're here. And that if we will just start to feed it and fan it, it will draw out our greatness, it will align our disparate selves, and it will start to move us in a direction that starts to feel better as we feel ourselves moving toward fulfillment and the overall reduction of want and of all different wants. This is great news. Like, life can be so much better. And even as I shoot this video, I am like in this rapturous bliss state, because this is all within alignment to my purpose. And in the modern world, there are ways to actually go after purpose and align the survival self, the social self, and the spiritual self. And this is part of that for me. I hope this is received as like really, really exciting news. And in the next video, we're gonna actually get into the mechanics of how we start to draw out our purpose, discover our purpose, align toward our purpose, grow into our purpose, expand our purpose, and ultimately have the roadmap of purpose actualization start to line up with the roadmap of our life itself. And by creating a life of purpose, we can start to experience, I think, an elevated state of being that is so far beyond what we see most of the world having to settle for today. So that's the good news, and that's what's to look forward to in the next video.